Everybody, it's Wendy Perry here, and I am the Entrepreneurship Facilitator for Adelaide with Switch Start Scale. I also have a role as a Managing Director for Workforce Blueprint. And this session today, I know we've got people coming in from all around Australia. I think we might have some international registrations as well. Just letting a few more people into the session as we go. It is recorded, so I know a number of you will be listening to it after today. And this webinar online session is one of a dozen that's happening this week as part of EntrepreneurFEST. Now, that is pulled together by the Australian Entrepreneurs Association, or Alliance, I should say. And that's because we have 23 entrepreneurship facilitators around the country in all different locations and states. Perhaps pop into the question chat box just to let me know if you've been in any other EntrepreneurFEST sessions this week. Just say yes or no, that'd be perfect. It's great. I can see Becky and Charlene and a bunch of people that we know well. So if you have been part of the festival, it's excellent that you've come along to today's session. And I can see lots of friends still joining us, so that's great. An interesting topic today, and I'm going to hand over to David McCann shortly from Mini Mammoth Games. And I don't know about you, but I am fascinated by the games development sector. I think it's because I might kind of like romanticize it or something because of movies that I love, like Ready Player One, which I saw at South by Southwest in Austin in Texas with Steven Spielberg when he actually launched it, which was next level nuts. And just recently I saw Free Guy as well. I don't know if anyone's seen Free Guy. If you want to pop into the question chat box or thumbs up, that is such a cool movie. But look, there's lots of reality versus fiction perhaps about the games development sector. It's huge, it's global. If you're not from South Australia, you might not understand, but we do have quite a strong game development sector here too. And David and his team are part of that. So he's going to take us through a bit about his experiences so far, heading up this game development company. And it would be great if you could just let us know like your interest. So if you could pop into the question chat box, like, are you actually in the games development sector? Are you just interested in it? Do you like to hear startup stories? Like, is there something in particular? Or like me, are you just a fan, of those movies and admire people that do cool creative stuff like that? So what I'll do now is just ask David McCann from Mini Mammoth Games to do a quick intro, and he's got some slides to run through. And I'll hand it over to you, David. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Wendy. Hello, everyone. I'm obviously David McCann. I work with Mini Mammoth Games in SA. Thank you for the lovely intro, Wendy. We really appreciate the time you're taking to spend with us for this stuff. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about hyper-casual games, the hyper-casual market, which is a large emerging trend inside of mobile gaming. And I've got my slide all set up for you all. So we'll just share that. There we go. Is that coming through?
Yes, it's all good. Excellent.
No worries. Okay, so I'm from Mini Mammoth Games. We specialize in making hyper-casual games, which is a subgenre in mobile development specifically. You're not going to find this market on Steam or on any of the distribution platforms for PC games. It's very particular to mobile development. So we'll start off a bit with talking over what hyper-casual games are, right? Because that sounds like gibberish, but why is it hyper? What does casual mean in this context? So the first thing most people who touch on hyper-casual as a genre talk about is Flappy Bird. Flappy Bird is a game that was released in May 24 of 2013. And it was originally a failure as far as the developer was concerned, until in January of 2014, it topped the free apps charts for the US and Chinese markets. And this was explicitly because a YouTuber had picked up the game and done a review of it. And this YouTuber, you might know him, might not, but that's PewDiePie, who is, I think, one of the #1 YouTube vloggers and like game streamers and stuff like that. So he took this game, he did a review, and suddenly it skyrocketed to the top of the charts in like 3 days or something like that. It received mixed and average reviews when it was first released, and it still holds a Metacritic score of 52 out of 100. And it's based on 7 reviews to this day. The app was criticized by Huffington Post. It was described it as an insanely irritating, difficult, and frustrating game, which combines a super steep difficulty curve with bad, boring graphics and jerky movement. And honestly, in a lot of hyper-casual games, you're going to get similar reviews, and yet they're still topping the charts. They're still making enormous installs because there's something about these games that gets people's notice and keeps them playing for like small bite-sized periods of time. So when we talk about hyper-casual games, we need to acknowledge, firstly, it's one of the fastest growing mobile markets in the globe. It continuously pops up in your breakdowns on the mobile gaming market. This is specifically a paper that was put out by Sensor Tower about the state of mobile gaming in 2021. And as you can see, hyper-casual type genres are, well, they're in the top 4. And then we've got a couple more further down. And this is pretty consistent across the board. Most places who are doing investigations into this stuff will put out similar graphs because arcade, social party, traversal games, these are all topping out in the top 10s for most of the Android Play Store. And it's a similar experience on the Apple App Store. We could talk a bit more about that in a couple of slides' time. But there's a distinct difference between the types of users for those games, which is why there's a difference in how often hyper-casual is picked up on Apple. So most important thing for a hyper-casual game is that it's bite-sized content. It's addictive, it's fast, it's easy for mobile owners to pick up, which also means it's easy for them to put it down. So there are some basic rules if you ever develop hyper-casual games that you should follow. Firstly, don't go overboard on your mechanics. So I realize we probably got not very many game developers in the crowd. So a mechanic is the way the player interacts with the game. So it's not about the underlying systems that dictate your scores or any of that stuff. It's all about like, what am I doing as a player to make Mario jump, as a good example. They also use simple camera angles and bright colors and a simple aesthetic. These 3 different little parts of their design are all about making the game approachable for players, but interesting and novel. They're different to the way most other games are running on mobile. And so as a result, your players are able to engage with them and get that sense of, oh, this is like a different product. What we've noticed in the last couple of years in the hyper-casual market is it's constantly evolving and changing. So simple camera angles is like a general rule, but you can't be like, well, you should have this specific like direction or perspective for your gameplay, because the market just shifts away from that a couple of months later. In terms of bright colors, it's all about making it readable in your advertising so that you can get those large user installs. So if you've got a little blue man running down a road, everyone can look at that in the first 3 seconds of an ad and understand that that's what's happening in that game. And generally, whatever you're doing to play it should also be communicatable in that 3 seconds. So he might need to jump over things. Or there was a recent trend, a recent top hit, which was called Fat to Fit, released by Voodoo. And that was all about a young woman who would eat burgers and get bigger, and she'd eat vegetables and she'd get thinner. You could see that in 3 seconds flat. It topped 50 million installs in the first 2 weeks of its release. These games are all over the shop, because on the other side of that spectrum, most hyper-casual games, they get thrown into the market after being built in a couple of weeks, and they don't get too many installs at all, or people don't engage with them. So that sort of brings us on to the developer priorities with these games. So we've touched on they need to be bright and colorful, but in terms of when you're designing a product, you need to focus on it being quick to develop. That needs to be your #1 priority when you're putting together these games, so that you can make them in a month. That's your goal. You want to take a product from prototyping in a week to a full release in a month, so that you can get all the data you need to see if that game will actually do well or not. It's a highly experimental market. The trends are consistently changing, Fat to Fit, as a good example, isn't in the top 10 anymore. It was there for 3 months and then it stopped, and now you can't find it in the top 100 apps downloaded on the App Store. So it's just one of those things where you need to keep on top of that stuff. You're also aiming for a wide audience. These games are supposed to be approachable. So when you advertise them to do your tests, you don't give any interests for your target audience. You don't give any specific ages. You run it from the minimum age you can to the maximum age. You aim for the American market rather than any other market, because that's the one that will be most profitable. And you just sort of hope that a bunch of people will play your game for a very small test and that you'll get enough data that tells you to continue developing that product. If you don't, you drop it and you move on to the next product as quickly as possible. So the hyper casual market is made to like create games quickly. With an experienced team, obviously you can actually achieve that. You can build the game, you can polish it, and you can release it within a month. And here at Mini Mammoth Games, we perfected that pipeline earlier this year. Obviously they're prototyped in a week. So you build them and then you throw them out in front of your customers, you see what the metrics come up, and then you run it away again. I've touched on it a little bit in the last couple of slides, but I really want to stress that this is a really data-driven market. The thing that's important, particularly for publishers, is the cost per install they get out of their adverts, is how long their players are playing the game, and in what way they're engaging with it. And we'll touch on that a bit further on. That might even be the next slide, actually. Here we go. It is. So our hyper-casual market is driven by metrics. Publishers and developers have different targets, but they all use some key metrics. So cost per install is a really interesting one. That's all about how well you actually market the product, how easily you've built a game that can be displayed to a player and that they can work out how it plays in 3 seconds. We talked a bit about that before, but this metric basically says I'm going to get this many players for this many dollars that I'm spending on my advertisement. From there, you go and you talk about your day 1 retention and your day 7 retention. And these metrics are a little bit more complicated. Unless you make a really shockingly bad game, most people will open it after they've downloaded it. That's day 0 retention. The question then becomes, will they come back to your game the next day, which is where day 1 comes in? And then 7 days later, will they play again? Now, for most publishers in the market, they use a CPI target of under 40 cents per install. And that's explicitly for the American market. With their day 1 retention, they're aiming for 35%, and their day 7 is 10. So if you're under those targets, sometimes they'll still take your product on because they want to explore different genres and that sort of thing. We'll get a bit more into that in a bit, but generally speaking, they're looking for those targets because then they can put in $1 million and know they'll get their money's worth. But the other side of that coin is publishers' goals with their business is different to your goals. You're a developer, you can actually make money with metrics that are less than the ones I just covered. Publishers want to be able to say they had a game in the top 10 on Android, and they want to be able to say that over and over and over again. So that's what they're looking for with their metrics. When you're building the game, you need to look at things like playtime for your average user. And then when you've monetized it, you can look from there into how do you give them the right ads or the right in-app purchases or the right other bits of monetization to make sure they're a profitable user. So I think it might be time for a few questions because I did just cover a lot of game development stuff. Please feel free to ask any that you need covered because we're going to move into discussing the market in a sec.
Yeah, I think it's really good. What was just sort of striking me is about those metrics, like obviously every sector's got specific ones, but they are very particular and they're quite different to what you might look at in a startup or a business in another kind of area. And I guess that notion of how to monetize. I've seen a number of comments, David, you might touch on this later, because I think people are thinking more about the theory, the gamification theory, and whether or not that's something that they can apply in their context with their business. And somebody, or Teresa's also talking about the therapeutic benefits of gaming. Charlene's interested in gamification in a specific context, which is in speaking. So where people might be developing their speaker business or profile and so on. So maybe that's some stuff that we can sort of touch on a little bit later.
Yeah, definitely.
And Sarah says, where would be the best point for a startup to start? So Sarah, you might want to pop in there. Do you mean a game development startup, or do you mean another kind of startup? If you could just clarify that a little bit for us, that'd be great. Or Sarah, you might want to unmute yourself and ask that question. I'll just give you a minute or a second or two in case you want to do that. Game development startup, Sarah says. Got any advice there, David?
Yeah, so hyper-casual is, we're going to touch on this a bit later, but because the market's constantly evolving, it's actually quite difficult for solo devs nowadays to engage with this market. It used to be that publishers would wrangle like 50 different developers from across the world, and they'd have them all making prototypes on their own, and then they'd run them through their program and they'd see what the metrics came back as. But as the audience has matured, a lot of users nowadays are looking for games that have really high quality in them, as well as all these other things that need to be met for the publishers. So in terms of my advice to a startup, specifically a game development startup, I think if you've got yourself and a couple of friends who can do like the different work. So generally with game development, we have 3 disciplines. We have our designers, our programmers, and our artists. And ideally you would have a team with at least 1 programmer and 1 artist and a designer. So if you're thinking as a startup, because we often talk about entrepreneurial stuff, you might come at this from the perspective that you're like a visionary and you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of how to develop games, which isn't a bad approach, but it means you'll need 3 different developers on your side rather than 1 or 2. So it might be worth looking into going and doing some trade courses. You can get some easy certs out of the Academy of Interactive Entertainment, and they only take a couple of months to finish. And you can do a lot just on game design specifically through those certificates. And I think like our approach here at Mini Mammoth Games, we like the distinction between the disciplines, but we're more than comfortable for people to move into the design space because it benefits from lots of different life experience. So from there, once you've got your small team, you can have larger teams, and we'll talk more about that later, but small team, try and develop that pipeline from nothing to having a game that you can test and try and get it down to really fast. The ideal is that you as a solo developer and your other peers in your company can all make different prototypes to test. And then you can get your data from that with like $100 test in the American market, or we're currently doing a few tests around this. We're hoping you can just use the worldwide market and get a bigger audience and then take that to a publisher and they will do tests in America. But the ideal is that you can build these prototypes relatively quickly, get your testing in early, and then go, oh, I shouldn't spend any time on these 3 games, but this one looked promising. So this is the one we'll polish up in the next 4 weeks. And while this all sounds really logical on the surface, a lot of game developers are very passion project oriented. And the appeal of the hyper-casual market is instead that they can make lots of different fun things, like little projects. So they get better at their trade skills, but they also get to experiment and try lots of things. Whereas you're going to have to sell that to them basically, because a lot of designers and developers come in and go, I'm going to make this one game. It's going to take me 5 years to build it, and then I will have made my life's passion work. Unfortunately, they also get to the end of that and discover that no one wanted to buy their game and that they've just spent 5 years working on it for nothing. So the hyper-casual market forces your creative team to approach creativity different. And at least here at Mini Mammoth Games, that's something we really like. We're a big fan of that. Yeah.
I think that data-driven approach is really key. And like you say, you do come across a number of people that just want to do this particular thing. And the fact that you've got such a quick development cycle for minimum viable product is really key. It'd be great to see more people apply that in other contexts. Just before we move on, David, Anne-Marie just asked if you could flick back to that slide with the metrics on it and just quickly highlight those couple of things for us.
So which ones were we talking about?
I think she was just keen to see, so it's the cost per install.
Yep.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think 40 cents or something, but then you
That's
talked about
one.
some percentages after that.
Sorry, what was that, Anne-Marie?
Sorry, I'm muted again. Yeah, I heard you mention 40 cents, and I was taking some notes, and then I heard you talk about percentages rather than I thought cents, but I might have got a bit mixed up there. So I
No,
couldn't type fast enough.
no, that's all good. So your cost per install is all about the amount of money it takes to get one person to play a game from your adverts. So that's why that's worked out in cents, because it's specifically about how much it costs. Your day 1 retention and your day 7 retention, that's all about when you got 100 people to play your game, how many of them came back the day after and how many came back 7 days after. So that's why that works in percentages, because it's more about like the larger body of players of your product.
And I recall you mentioned a 30% rate.
Yep. So as one of the things part of the reason I didn't put the numbers into the slides is because they change. They change based on what publisher you're using. They change based on what your metrics are. They change on what genre you're working in. So for example, we're currently working on what's called an arcade idle game. It's all about like the idle mechanics around generating money and stuff like that. It doesn't focus so much on cost per install initially. What they tend to look at is how long a player engages with the game. So the numbers I've used, which is 40 cents for the cost per install, and then 35% for your day 1 retention and 10% for your day 7 retention. They're ballparks, but every publisher will have different numbers, and you might find you need different numbers as well. In particular, the day 7 retention is it fluctuates a lot, because some games people love them and they'll play them to death, and publishers will be like, that's what we want. So they'll have a really high one, like 10% is actually pretty high for a day 7 retention. Whereas other publishers are like, we're more focused on getting our players through the game quickly and making sure we make money out of them. And so their day 7 retention might only be like 2 or 3%. So that's really very flux.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that really helped in the detail. Appreciate it. But whilst I'm here, I might just ask I put the question a little bit further down. How important is the App Store description? Does that even matter, or do they mainly pick up these sorts of games via ads?
My impression is that once it gets into the top 10, Mini Mammoth Games hasn't yet got any top 10s, just so we're all on the same page. But my impression is once it gets there, it gets a lot more organic installs. And organic installs are great because they're basically free. Someone else paid for the advertising, put it into the top 10, and then you get any installs from that. This is also why you should often focus on your your engagement with your audience and make sure your marketing's all over it. So you'll find on the Mini Mammoth Games Facebook page, we're regularly putting out content just to keep that sort of relevant. And we'll talk more about this later, but like having the ability to redirect traffic from some of your games to other games, because if they like the aesthetic or the engagement of one, they might like some of your other products as well. Where that's more of a Mini Mammoth Games thing than a market staple, I guess. But organic installs are really handy. So things like getting to the top of the charts, having the Android store say, yeah, we like your game, it's getting a lot of traffic, we're going to start referring people to it, can happen as well. Yeah. And I believe it's the same for the Apple App Store. And if you get into the Chinese market, then everything gets really complicated really fast because they have a lot of different stores over there.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Because I did wonder about the difference, because I know that with these with these games that they are in and out very quickly. So just knowing that there's that other aspect that is potential. So is the top 10 your target for one of those strategic targets, David?
For Mini Mammoth Games, it definitely is. For all of our products, we'd love to get them into the top 10. So that's one of the reasons why we continue working with publishers, because in that context, our goals and their goals are very aligned. But it's not required to get like a positive revenue from your product. Like it's a nice to have. It will get you a lot of organic installs and you should totally aim for it, but you shouldn't let that stop you from exploring other ways of making sure your product pays for itself.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, David. There's a few more questions, but I think we probably need to do the next section, then we'll come back and have a look at those.
Oh, good. Okay, in that case, we'll pop down to break and then we'll move on to the next one. So now we're going to talk more about the market, funnily enough. So this is more of like a background about mobile games and the hyper-casual market within that state. If you know a lot about that, I'm about to throw a bunch of numbers at you. You probably already know, and I'm sorry about that. But I think it's really important to reiterate that like more than 40% of all of our smartphone usage is devoted to games. Now, those figures come from a tech jury blog. And in it, it makes note of numbers such as the fact that the mobile games revenue was expected to hit 76.7 billion USD in 2020. And that more than 55% of the games currently being played fit within our casual, our arcade, or our puzzle games area. Now, it's important to note casual is not quite the same as hyper casual. A casual game includes things like, well, they've got puzzle, so maybe it doesn't include Candy Crush, but I would think it does because it used to. But it includes a lot of other games that can't be built in a month. Like they've got more mechanics to them, they've got more systems underlying them. But still, that's like an enormous chunk of the market that's just devoted to hyper casual products, or like to casual products. Yeah, I find it interesting that we spend more than 40% of our time playing games, but we only download about 20% of them. But that's like an interesting quirk. I couldn't really make too many conclusions from that one. The conclusions that tech jury tend to make is that we spend a lot of our time on our phones and that a lot of that time is spent playing games. And I tend to agree with that. Most of the people we've polled and talked to are of the similar opinion. And it's why the mobile game space in particular is so focused on retention. Because if you can keep a player for a month rather than a week, then you didn't need to advertise to that player to get him to come back. From there, we can talk a bit more about like specifically hyper casuals. We're going to drill down into it. The installs have skyrocketed. A large part of this is probably due to the way the world has changed between 2018 and 2021, but not all of it. Hyper casuals have always been on the rise, and I think it reflects a trend in gaming as like a general idea where in the same way that developers can get a lot of enjoyment out of making different games every month and like having different mechanics and all of that thing, I think players get a lot out of that as well, because they can just drop what they're doing and move on to another product and not feel bad about it. Because I think there's a lot, like in the traditional game playing markets, there's a lot of old baggage from like the 90s and the 80s around having to finish games, having to make sure that like, oh, I started playing this story, I have to know what happens at the end. But our world isn't really structured very well for that nowadays. Like a lot of people just don't have that much time to commit to it. So the hyper casual market lets them get like some enjoyment without needing to be overly invested in the product. And I think that we're going to see that trend just continues to skyrocket out of control over the next few decades, because people are always busy. There's always something you need to do. And you might have some downtime of 5 minutes or whatever. We've seen audiobooks and other like media types start to try and exploit that trend. And I think the hyper casual market is the game space's response to that. In terms of some other metrics, like in September, this September, I pulled these numbers. Like we had more than 9 of the top 10 games in the Android Play Store were all hyper casual products, all games that have been built in a month and people were engaging. Popular hyper casuals will on average pull in 5 to 10 million downloads, and the casual and hyper casual products can also hit 50 million downloads. And if you're thinking about that, like what do those numbers mean? If my average playtime for my players is 2 to 3 minutes, and in that time I can serve them a bunch of different ads, then it's more than likely if my CPI is low enough, I make 5 cents for every user. And if that's the case, then 50 million downloads is still like a nice paycheck for a product that only took a month to put together. So that's why it's big business here at this point. You're working out the numbers and coming out the other side. Yeah. So this also like illustrates more about how developers are monetizing their projects. So the hyper casual genre doesn't lend itself easily to things like in-app purchases and like loot boxes and other trends that are sort of starting to turn up in other spaces of the game industry. They don't really work very well in hyper casual because we expect our players to log on, play the game for a couple of minutes, log off, they'll come back again over the course of the week, but they're not really looking to just buy things. They're not looking to spend money in their products. They're looking to get a fun experience for a couple of minutes, and they're willing to watch ads for that. And that's sort of where the hyper casual market is moving towards, like, or at least it's where it started. And we'll talk a bit more about like other types of monetization in a bit, but it started with banner ads. Like Flappy Bird made absurd amounts of money in 3 months from banner ads. And I think it might have had some interstitials. And if you don't know what those are, so our banner ad is the little ads at the top of the bottom. I think everyone knows what that is because of web pages. But the interstitial ads are the ones that, if you're a good hyper casual developer, they won't interrupt how the game works. But a lot of people do it anyway. And so they'll pop up, they'll take over the screen. You can't do anything while it's happening. And then when it's finished, it goes away. There's also another trend in the last couple of years around rewarded ads. And a lot of casual games in particular have at this point just not bothered with banner ads or interstitial ads. They're just not worth as much as the rewarded ad. And what the rewarded ad does is it ties directly into your game's economy. And it says, I'm going to give you this good thing that you want because it could be a skin or it could be coins or equipment or whatever. And it says, I'll give you that, but you got to watch this ad first. And the impression I get from like advertisers is that those ads are the ones most likely to actually get a player to click through on them and engage with whatever the advertisement was going for. So they pay more for reward ads just in general, and players engage with them more because players also get what they want out of it. They get a skin or they get coins. So the hyper casual trend at the moment is moving towards trying to make more complex economies. And I think that's because they want to exploit rewarded ads more. In terms of the way the games are made, it's harder to do that. And I think that reflects an emerging trend in this market, which is that people just want higher quality products. So we talked a bit about market. The next set of slides will talk about monetization. So I'd hold your questions till later regarding that. But please, if you've got any other questions about like the size of the market or how people get engaged with, like, how do I pay to get my games made before they've made any money and stuff like that, please ask.
Cool. Well, you might want to filter some of these questions out, David, but I'll feed them to you. This one might fit in the next part, but it was asked earlier, and it was, are there kind of like average costs for advertising hyper casual games?
Average costs. So there's average costs for like the tests you do to check retention and day one and stuff like that. So normally what's run is a 5-day or a 3-day advertising campaign with a budget of $100. So in case there's anyone out there who's worked in like old school marketing, at least the way marketing works in Facebook and stuff like that nowadays is that you set the budget and it just runs until the budget's run out. So $100 tests are what the industry sets as the standard for their advertising campaigns. But again, like that's why CPI is such an important metric, because $100 might only get you 10 people, or it might get you 100 or 200 or 500 or whatever. So, yeah.
And then Teresa, I'm wondering if you would like to unmute yourself. You had a question there about free games and ads and so on, and then how businesses and game developers work. Do you want to unmute?
Hey, so I'm just wondering.
Oh, I'm going to have a hard time hearing that one. Sorry, guys.
Can you hear?
Need to turn up my volume.
It's a little bit quiet, Teresa.
Sorry. Shall I type it?
Well, I can read it out. So I think you might just need to clarify this. You said for free games, the ads pay for the games, ? What kind of contracts are made between businesses, and what different kinds of contracts, I should say, are made between businesses and the game developers?
Right. So for a while there in the hyper casual market, a lot of publishers would just pay work for hire, which was really good for developers because they put $10,000 down before you could actually make the product, and then you'd have that money for your wages. in recent times, I'd say in the last 12 months, publishers have moved towards like partnership engagements. This can be seen as like a positive or a negative, depending on your attitude towards it, because they bring to the table a bunch of game designers that they've hired in-house that they then field out to hundreds of different game developers who are just like hyper casual experts. And they also come in with their input on how to make ads. So suddenly you go from getting the publisher who generally works with the marketing side of things to make the ads. Now developers make their own, which, at least for Mini Mammoth Games, we aren't overly fussed about it. We have the capacity to achieve that, but it does mean that one of our developers spends a lot of her time making adverts rather than building game stuff. So it's not the best outcome as far as we're concerned. In terms of the contracts you get from it, if you do well with your game, you'll get a publishing contract. And I really want to caution anyone who does get into this market when it comes to publisher contracts, make sure you read them and make sure you push for what you actually think you're worth. So one of the things they do is they say, we're going to spend $100,000 or $500,000 on your user acquisition. And then we're going to get that reimbursed, and you get whatever's left after that reimbursement. And what they don't mention in that process is also that they're getting money from your advertising, because they've insisted that you use their ad mediation rather than other people's. For context, ad mediation is where you can get like lots of different advertising organizations to send someone ads, and then they distribute them. So publishers effectively come out double dipping, and you get left with sort of what's on the other side, but there's nothing mentioned in their contracts about getting reimbursed for your own development time. There's nothing in there about bonuses or milestones, and there's no oversight on how often they can run a user acquisition campaign, which in theory and in practice for a lot of developers has meant that a publisher will take them on, tell them they're going to have a great game, get them up to top 10, but the game developer never actually sees a cent, because what the publisher's doing is running that user acquisition campaign over and over and over again to meet their goals, not your goals. And they can't do that without your game. So you really need to put your foot down when it comes time to talk like contracts effectively. And honestly, that's probably a good idea just in general for running a business and being an entrepreneur, is like, look at your contracts and make sure you're getting what you deserve. Expect people to behave appropriately within the contract. If you let them do something in a contract, you should expect them to then do it. So logically, if you think if like you're super keen to get your name out there in the world, it might be really handy to have the publisher just run that user acquisition campaign over and over again. But you should make that decision deliberately rather than discover it later.
So David, just 3 really quick questions. What market is bigger, Android or iOS?
It's about 50-50, but they engage with monetization differently. The Apple market, they like to buy things and they don't much like ads. Whereas obviously the Android market, we want a lot of things free, and then we'll maybe engage with your monetization if you're lucky. So you have to build your games a little bit differently depending on what market you're aiming at.
The next one is, what programming language is in favor in the gaming industry at the moment?
Ooh, that really depends, but you can't go wrong with C++. So at Mini Mammoth Games, I think I saw someone ask what engine we use. We use Unity. So we focus on C# as a programming language we're using, but Unreal, if you're a programmer, not a designer or an artist, you want to code in Unreal in C++. If you're a designer or an artist, you program using flowcharts and a whole bunch of other stuff that'll be fun to learn, and it's very engaging and it looks very pretty. It's not programming in the same sense as writing code down though.
Cool, we answered that 3rd question. So do you want to move on to the next bit, and then I'll check for any more as we go?
Sorry about that.
No, that's perfect. It's great.
All right, cool. So now we're going to talk a bit about the Mini Mammoth approach. Did we miss monetization? I feel like we didn't. We'll come back to it. Okay, so our approach to the games, to the hyper casual market is pretty straightforward. I think I've touched on this. We look at quality. So we're always trying to predict where the market will be, and that's kind of how you have to engage with it. And one of the trends that's clearly rearing its head is that as the customer base, as the audience gets more saturated with different games, the audience is becoming more like picky about the types of games they're engaging with. So we know that one of the things they want is a quality product. And it's very hard to get that balance right between making quality and doing it quickly. So we try to balance that out with our team as a startup is actually a bit bigger than most game developers would start out as, since there's 8 of us rather than 4. And so we can balance those needs a bit better. It's still very hard to get right. There are a few games that will come out from Mini Mammoth Games that one day we'll need to go back over. Either that or we'll pull them from the App Store, because that's important for us setting our brand and a bunch of other things. But like if you're just a game developer trying to look into this, trying to find different pipelines that let you make quality quickly is going to set you up for the market 6 months or 12 months from now rather than right now. That brings us to another goal with Mini Mammoth Games. We're trend setting, not trend chasing. So you'll find in a lot of different developers in the hyper casual market, they don't so much look at making new games. They look at making games that have already gotten to the top 10, and they try to make those games as quickly as possible so that they can horn in on that market share. We're not interested in doing that. It doesn't align with our values as an organization. It's also not very interesting because you're just making something that already exists. And as I have a friend who I did a bunch of game development with, and he always points out like that game you're using as a reference already exists. You can't make it again. So these people are ignoring that advice and making the game 5 times over. It's not a great practice for a game developer. What this also means, though, is that because we're looking 6 months in the future, we're trying to pick the trends that will be relevant by then. And it's still an experiment, but we think it's going to pay dividends long run. Because one of the things that allows you to do is explore genres that are just starting to emerge. And what we've noticed is publishers in particular have started engaging in like competitions and other different organized events for their game developers that suddenly make the market have like 12 or 20 versions of this game or this genre online. And then the publisher tries to publish one of those and spit huge quantities of money in it, which will make a new niche appear in the market, whether we want it to or not. So if we're trying to pick something 6 months in advance, engaging with publishers and seeing what events they're running is a good way to do that. And as a good example, we currently have a game that we're working on called Ocean Harvest. You can find it on the App Store in its very, very early prototype stage. And it's all about like you run around, you explore the world, and you make money by selling different resources that you're harvesting from the world around you. It's called an arcade idle game. If you were a new developer getting into the hyper casual space, I really think the arcade idle genre is somewhere to focus your attention because it has really high play times. So our game that's not very well optimized at the moment on the Play Store, and it's got a bunch of other problems because the whole development was rife with client issues and other things. But we're really proud of Ocean Harvest because it still pulls in a playtime of 6 minutes. It's like if you download it, it might make your phone melt, but it's still really interesting and engaging for people, and they still played it for 6 minutes of their time. So we've spent another month and a half working on new content for that and refining it, and we think that's going to go really well. So finally, we're novel IP focused. So this kind of ties back in with trend setting, but it's really important that we talk about how our games actually differ themselves from their peers, because you still got to use the trends that exist in the market. You've still got to make runners. You've still got to have your little blue men who are trying to dodge cars and all of that stuff if you make a runner, because that's what your players are expecting. They want that comfortable sort of, if I download this, I expect this game to sort of fit with what I'm after. But on the other side of that coin, obviously, you don't want to be chasing after your peers. You don't want to be making their games. You don't want to do any of that stuff. So the way we focus on that is all about theming our products and making sure that they look distinct enough once you get into the game. So past that CPI install period. And what it means is we can create an ecosystem of independent users who clearly like our products. And so we can then give them other products from us, whether that's through targeted advertising using interests on Facebook, or even just having like the capacity to redirect traffic from in-game using our own internal banner. So that independent little ecosystem of users means that you've got ideally users who will migrate from game to game, and you get more bang out of your advertising bucks. At the end of the day, the other thing being, like, if every game can be marketable, then we should try and build every game to be marketed. And Flappy Bird is a really good example of this. I brought it back. Flappy Bird obviously failed, and then 12 months later made an absurd amount of money. What that tells us about the market is not that it's fickle, but that sometimes things get lost in it. And if someone picks it up later and they go, oh, this game's really great, it might go gangbusters. So what that means for us is, like, every game we make in that prototyping phase, in that 1 month period of time, might be something that gets picked up 6 months or 12 months or 9, or however long away from there, and go bananas. And we need to be able to go back to that product and go, well, it's not a problem that it's done this. Like, it's not leaning in on any big known IPs or any of that stuff. So novel IP focused for Mini Mammoth Games really is about risk mitigation, and it's about making interesting stuff for our users. Yeah. Just because I'm giving the talk, I'm going to spruik a couple of our products, but you can find our stuff on Android, and you can find these games on Apple as well. You'll find that we've got Bundle Rush, it's a little puzzle game, Critter Capture, and Press for Time. Critter Capture is all focused about bugs. Press for Time is all about crushing different things. They're our early games. We're really proud of them, but they don't necessarily fit the ethos for hyper casual specifically. They allowed us to build the pipelines we needed though. And so coming back to advice for new developers, like, if your first games do end up blowing up, like size, scale wise, and it goes from being 1 month development to 3 months development, if it still looks good and it's still a good product and you're still proud of it, that's still a good thing to get from it. It didn't take you 5 years to make it. And it means that you can bring it back to other people later on. If you do get a really successful game, you can even redirect your traffic to it. Yeah. So that's us. That's the hyper casual market. Do anyone have any more questions? Because I think we've got 15 minutes left.
Yeah, so I think Anne-Marie's saying she's going to get lost in all the games. she's worried about that. But Emily, I know that you had a question earlier about the soft educational games, and I think a number of people online would potentially be in that sort of space too, where there's some sort of content area or knowledge area, and it might be not just a game for fun, but also have some educational outcomes. Do you want to ask your question, Emily, or I can reflect it back? If you want to ask it, Emily, just unmute yourself and go for it. All right, I'll just go back up here. So Emily says she'd like to know, David, if you've got much experience or opinions in the soft education gaming area. So Anne-Marie, who was asking you questions before, she's also the entrepreneurship facilitator up in Ipswich in Queensland. They're looking at a parent and kids activity app, and they're going to release it before the end of the year. So they're going to be encouraging families away from tech, but also using the app or the game as a tool to do this. So what do you think about that kind of, I guess it's not necessarily full-on educational content, but there might be some learning-based content in some of the games, particularly for either adults or for children in this case.
I think that sounds really cool. I like the idea. In terms of educational content, a lot of designers spend a lot of their careers trying to master that ability to deliver educational content. Because the thing is, like, every game needs to teach a player something. And so it's a really transferable skill set there. You spend most of your time making tutorials and other stuff, and all you're trying to do is teach players, instead of, hey, this is how you play the game, it's this is how you do math, or this is how you treat others with respect, or whatever variety of stuff you're teaching them. One of the things I've recently had a conversation about around gamifying industry and stuff like that was all about, this fella came to me and he wanted to encourage his employees to engage with a program they just weren't engaging with. They weren't interested in it, mainly because they didn't have time. And the program was all about getting ideas to make their jobs easier. So he didn't really understand why they wouldn't engage with that. Like the reward is intrinsic. If you engage with this, your job will get better. But the reality is, like, there's a bunch of stuff before you even need to gamify it with an app that you can do, which is just like, what he wasn't doing was going out and thanking the people that already engaged with his program. He wasn't just being like, hey, I saw that you put a bunch of suggestions in there. Thank you. So when you think about gamification or education, it's really important to think about your targets. So with a tutorial for a normal game, you can just be like, well, my target is this audience, and I think they will engage with a tutorial this way. For hyper casual games, the answer to that question is they won't engage with a tutorial very well at all, which is why you keep the game so small. That might be a good methodology for teaching young kids to do certain things as well, because if you can make it really basic to engage with, but it teaches them something important, then you know they're going to get that information. On my end, I did a bit of work with unis a couple of years back when I was on placement, and that was all about trying to teach social workers how to engage with the environment when they went to do house visits. It's different work. I think game designers have a lot to contribute to it, but they need to be excited for it first.
Cool. And then I know Tasha. Tasha, can you let me know if you want to unmute yourself? You just asked another question, and there was a couple there that were kind of technical. I don't know if you've got a mic available, but if you do, feel free to unmute.
Hi, it's really for my son Joseph. I really don't know much about the gaming world. Oh no, did you want to ask any other questions? Did you want to ask any about Godot in that?
Oh yeah. So do you have any experience or know anything about Godot? It's the engine I use, and I'm wondering if it's any good for making hyper casual games.
So we did have a representative of Godot reach out a couple of months ago, and we did a bit of investigation. As an engine, it's new, and I think it wants to position itself as an alternative to Unreal and Unity. And like, it's free to entry. The barrier to entry is pretty low. If you're starting out learning how to make games, any of those low barrier to entry engines is going to be good for you. In terms of making hyper casual games, like, what it really needs to do that well is just be able to support Android very easily. Like, you need to be able to push it through the build process, get yourself an APK, and you need that to be relatively well supported. So engines like Unity, as a good example, are really well supported for mobile development. Unreal, on the other hand, mobile development is not great. It's not industry standard. It's not recommended, which is odd because Unreal is apparently great for everything else, but mobile, they just don't do very well. In terms of Godot, like, after our own assessment of it, it wasn't worth switching from Unity to Godot. That wasn't because it was a bad engine, though. It's just we already have a lot of processes and pipelines in place to enable development for Unity. So if you're keen to make some prototypes and throw them to developers or to publishers, your first step is learning how to make a mobile game with Godot. And if that's easy, fantastic. If it's not, I'd recommend just moving to Unity. It's well supported. Most people know it.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
Excellent. I didn't really know what that question was about, but I appreciate that coming through from Tasha's son there. So look, has anyone got any other questions? Just feel free to unmute yourself or put into the question chat box. David, I had a question. I know that you sort of have a bit of a philosophy about not doing any harm. So I don't suppose you're going to be making the next, sort of games that are terribly violent or I've got that. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into that? The fact that you want to sort of be known for not doing certain types of genres or games.
So that's a really complicated one. I actually am a big fan of like gratuitous violence in games, but like cartoonish stuff, like when Roadrunner gets hit with a hammer or something like that. From an ethical standpoint, there's a lot we don't know about how humans learn different types of behaviors, because we know that obviously the world is full of violent games, but like that doesn't mean that there's a sudden rise in violent activities in, say, Australia or something every time a Call of Duty releases. But on the other side of that, I know as a designer, like my goal is to teach people specific behaviors when they play games so they get better at those behaviors and play the game better. And that means I am having an impact on the way they view the world. So when Mini Mammoth Games talks about like a positive impact on the world, what we don't want is to make a game that teaches people behaviors that are bad for them, right? And so as a good example, there's what's called a gacha mechanic. It comes from Japan, and it's all about, it's similar to like loot boxes and a bunch of other similar ideas in the industry. It's all about like effectively gambling, but like legally you're not gambling, right? You're making a guess that you're going to get something, and if you don't get it, that's a bummer, but it's not gambling. I didn't bet on it. On our end, it still has the potential for someone who maybe is prone to being addicted to things to engage with your game and then maybe bankrupt themselves. And that's just unacceptable as far as we're concerned. Our products should not be making the world a worse place. We want to entertain people. We want them to have fun. We don't mind teaching them like new skills or even giving them an opportunity to engage with ideas they don't normally engage with. But when we make mechanics or systems for our players, we are always making sure they're not going to teach them things that are really harmful to themselves or to the people around them. And yeah, all of our values with Mini Mammoth Games are dictated towards making sure we don't create a circumstance that's really harmful to people.
No worries. Now, I guess if people have got some sort of game concept or game sort of idea, what's the best next step for them, do you think? Like, it still might be in their head. It might be something that they've started to document. Have you got any advice for people as to, what to do next?
Yeah, so if you're an entrepreneur and you have no game development experience, I'd reach out to either someone that does. If you don't know anyone like that, I reach out to like the Academy of Interactive Entertainment as a good example. But I think CDW and Flinders all have like educational organizations devoted to it as well. They often have evangelicals who are all like, let's make the games industry great. So someone will be able to tell you more about all of that stuff to get you like in the door, because you need like a base level understanding of the industry. Most people who have entrepreneurial experience get that. If you're a game developer, it goes the other way. I really strongly recommend you learn more about how business works before you get too involved in the hyper-casual market, so that when it comes time to have those hard discussions with publishers, you don't come out the other side 3 months later being like, oh, wow, I just got screwed.
Okay, and I was even thinking about an app or a game or something like that, but I know a number of people online are as well. But is that something open to just maybe having a chat about, David, or how would that work?
100%. So you've got our social media options here, and the contact at Mini Mammoth Games will come straight through to my inbox, so I'll be able to get in contact with you. And I'd love to chat all about that. We also, for those people who are feeling a bit more like super keen to get involved, we have a whole process around like building a brief effectively for a client. So you can come to us, say, I've got this idea, and we'll go through a whole process with you to get that idea out of your head and onto like a game design document with the technical details documents and the art Bible and whole kit. And it's a relatively painless process. It takes us under a week to make all of those details. It does cost a little bit because we have to pay everyone to make sure they've got food on their table. But that, on the other side of that coin, you can take that documentation to chase up grants. You can take it to chase up your own developers. And more importantly, one of the things that happens with game development in general is scope tends to become like this uncontrollable monster as you start thinking about your idea. You have all these fun, exciting things, and it gets really hard to compress it back down into like a manageable sized project. So we'll help you do that if you come to us.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. It's just been a fascinating kind of chat. It's an area I definitely wanted to know more about, and I hope that you've got a little bit of insight into that too. And David, you've been really generous with what you've kind of shared, which I think everybody appreciates a lot. So let's put some thank yous into the question chat box for David. And I know you've got the team there behind you that helped you get ready for today. There's more sessions in terms of the entrepreneurship EntrepreneurFest tomorrow. So if anyone wants to go along, feel free. I can see all those thank yous coming in now, David. That was really insightful. And thanks so much. And any final things that you wanted to say just before we sign off?
I feel like I've waffled on a lot for the last hour. Thank you all for listening to me, though. I really appreciate your time.
No worries, that's great. Thanks, everybody. We'll sign off now and we'll catch you at either a face-to-face or an online session again soon. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Wendy. Bye.